Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first lesson video for critical thinking skills. As I mentioned several class periods ago, we're going to be using critical thinking skills and being introduced to them throughout our unit on the Secret Life of Bees. And we're going to be practicing them both with the Secret Life of Bees and in these lessons in order to master them and being able to use them ourselves. The first critical thinking skill we're going to cover is inference. This is probably something you're very familiar with, but there's more to it than just guessing what's going to happen in a story. To infer something means to take a guess based on information that you already know. Evidence is extremely important in this inference, in this guess that you make, because it's going to be that evidence, those details, that you completely base your inference upon. Now, this inference that you make doesn't need to be based in the future. You're making an inference about what will happen, even though that's how it's often or usually used. You can also make an inference based on something in the past, something completely theoretical, or something that's not necessarily related to time at all. A good way to make an analogy about the evidence in this inference is a scientific hypothesis or experiment. Just like in science, new information builds on old information. You can't reach new scientific discoveries unless you've got a solid understanding and a solid base of old information. So in an inference, you would create a new investigation, in a sense, based on the information that's in the original text or in original reality. But you got to make sure that your evidence is based in fact and truth. Just like in that scientific investigation, if you've got bad science or fake science, or the experiment was done badly, anything you base upon that bad information will also be faulty. So if you base in an inference your information on false assumptions, what you build upon those false assumptions will also be faulty. As we go through these critical thinking lessons, I'm going to tie them back to the warm-up we did about the Odyssey before we took the test. I'm going to be doing this in order to have examples and explain these critical thinking terms. If you remember, the question that related to inference went like this. You read that Odysseus went to the land of the dead to hear the prophecy, despite knowing that he might not make it back out. Infer what would have happened if he had decided not to take that risk and chosen to instead continue sailing home immediately. Now, as we went over, in order to make an inference, you need to establish first what evidence you're going to base it upon. What do you know? So, in this situation, what do you know? There are 5 bits of information that you know that could help you decide what would have happened in this alternate scenario. First, you know what Odysseus learned in the land of the dead. You know what happened to him after the episode, Cattle of the Sun God. You know Odysseus' personality and the personalities of his men, and can guess how they would have acted. And you also know the gods' opinion on matters such as this and how they would have acted. Let's start with that first point. What did Odysseus learn in the land of the dead? Well, he learned from the prophet Tiresias that he should not kill Helios' cattle, and that he would be severely punished, and his men would be severely punished, should they kill those cattle. He would not have known any of this had he not gone to visit Tiresias in the land of the dead. He would not have known that those cattle were off limits. Let's cover these next 3 points together. First of all, we've read the whole Odyssey. We know what happened to Odysseus after the episode of the Cattle of the Sun God. We know that everyone except him died in a storm caused by Zeus, because everyone except him took part in the slaughtering of Helios' cattle. We also know the personality of Odysseus. We know he's been very confident and headstrong and proud throughout the whole epic poem. And we also know he's tried hard to take care of his men throughout the whole poem. For example, in the episode of the Cyclops, he was very confident in his understanding of Greek culture and that culture of hospitality, that when he arrived at the Cyclops' cave, he went ahead and took that food without asking, even after learning that the Cyclops did not take part in that Greek culture of hospitality. He went ahead and was not worried about taking the food because he was so sure that he and his worldview were correct in this hospitality. We also understand the personalities of Odysseus' men. His men are very disobedient to him, even though he looks out for them, while their decision to slaughter the cattle of the sun god was in large part influenced by their hunger and not wanting to starve. It also was very much to do with their disobedience to Odysseus. They were influenced by hunger, but they also allowed their lack of obedience to their captain to influence their decision to deliberately disobey his orders just because he was away. Lastly, we are also very familiar with how the gods would think of something like this. The gods think Odysseus should always be responsible for his men because he is their captain, and even though he wasn't present when his men disobeyed him, they expected him to be responsible anyway. We also know that Helios threatens to take the sun to the underworld, and the gods obviously don't want that, which is why Zeus punished Odysseus' men like Helios asked. So if the gods are willing to severely punish whoever is to blame, and they're also willing to blame whoever they can, this is an inference within an inference, but we can infer that the gods would have blamed Odysseus even if he didn't know that he wasn't supposed to touch the cattle, because Helios would have been just as angry either way, so they would have blamed him and punished him in the same sense, whether he knew or not, just like they blamed him and punished him in the same way when he had his men disobey him when he was not around. So now that we've established what information, what evidence we already have, it's time to put it together and conclude, infer, what would have happened in this alternate scenario. To review, we know what Odysseus learned and what information he would have missed had he not gone to the land of the dead. We know how he was punished and how his men were punished after the slaughter of the cattle. We know the personalities of Odysseus and his men and how they acted, and how the gods acted or would have acted in a situation such as this. So what does that mean? Well, what we can conclude is that Odysseus would have eaten the cattle with his men and then died in Zeus's storm right alongside his men. So how did we get there? Well, we know that Odysseus would not have known that the cattle were off limits. And in the episode of the Cyclops, he just went ahead and took the food that was there. So he would have taken the food that was already there in this situation too. There's cattle there, hospitality, let's just take it. We know that everyone who took part in the slaughtering of the cattle died. So if we say Odysseus would have taken part in the slaughtering of the cattle, then he would have died as well, because the personality of Odysseus and the personality of his men, if they didn't have this information, that would have led them to freely eat from the cattle. And the personalities of the gods, the decisions of the gods, as this episode has shown us and other episodes have shown us, they would be willing to punish severely any men who transgress them. And if Odysseus and his men transgressed them due to not having the appropriate information, then they would have punished everyone who made the poor decision and went against them, regardless of what information those individuals had. The information about how to make an inference for an alternate situation in a story may be good information, but it's not often that you will be asked to do something like that in your English classes. But something that you will have to do, and very soon, is write a research paper. That is something that you'll have to get used to throughout your high school or even college experience. And something very smart that you could do before you start a research paper is to infer what information you might find and how you can put that information together. So you would have to base it upon the evidence of what you already know and what the prompt asks you, and also infer what information you want to or need to know in order to get this research paper accomplished. Something to note when you are making this inference when it comes to research assignments is do not use unapproved resources when making your inferences. Now what that means is not to use information that does not go well with what is true and what is asked of you. If you were writing a research paper about the Odyssey, you would have to use only the Odyssey or only interpretations of the Odyssey by people who know what they're talking about. You would not, for example, use Percy Jackson in a research paper about the Odyssey, because even though Percy Jackson uses a lot of the same characters as the Odyssey, it is not the same thing. Those characters are interpreted differently. They are different people than what is truly in the work. And the same thing, to bring it back to the scientific investigation analogy, If you're making a scientific investigation, you would have to be very careful to use studies that are only scientifically accurate and not studies that sound good but have flaws in their experimentation that mean they may not be exactly true. So again, to wrap that up, be very sure that the evidence, the information that you base any inference upon, is solid and good. Otherwise, any flaws that are in your original evidence will also exist in the inference that you make. Let's try to make this research paper example a little more concrete. Say, for instance, you have been assigned to write a research paper about dragons. You would need to establish what it is you know about dragons in order to infer what it is you will find about dragons, and then how you will use what you expect to find in order to craft a research paper. Naturally, dragons are not real, so you would know from the get-go that you shouldn't expect to find information about their habitat, their genetic relation to other animals such as lizards or birds, or how to keep one as a pet. So you would know that that information likely does not exist, and if you do find it, not to look at it because it wouldn't be true. What you should expect to find is information about the mythology and history behind dragon lore, different cultures' representations and interpretations of the dragon legend, and famous tales featuring dragons throughout history and throughout many different cultures. So now that you know to expect to find this type of information, you can start to craft an idea of what you're going to write about dragons. You can write about all three of these things and make a 5-paragraph essay, or you can pick just one of them and delve into it in more detail in however long the essay needs to be. So we haven't even started researching, we haven't gone to any library or looked into any database, and yet we've already decided what our research paper might be about and have gotten a head start on our organization and information. Now, whether you are making this inference for a research paper or for anything else, it's absolutely crucial that you are able to explain it not only to another person and to your reader, but to yourself, because that reader will not have all the evidence that you have, and so will not be able to follow your inference unless you explain it to them step by step how you came to that conclusion. Doing that step-by-step explanation to your reader will help them understand, but you should also do that for yourself so that you can understand whether there are holes in your logic, or whether you are skipping a step or using your own biases to make a step that would lead to a flawed inference. That thinking about your own thought process is called metacognition, and it's a very important skill to have in your classes and outside of your classes, because it will allow you to understand whether your own thinking is logical, whether it makes sense to other people, and whether it is based truly on your information or whether your information is based on your own biases or misconceptions. Finally, there are some questions you need to ask yourself as part of the critical thinking and inference process. First, is your inference logical? Does it truly make sense? And does it follow directly from the information that you have been given? You need to establish that there are none of your own biases that are coloring and filling in gaps in your reasoning when you create this inference, because the information that you use should be based solely on the original source material and not on any of your own opinions. Don't fill in gaps in your reasoning with anything that comes from yourself, but things that come from the source material and related approved materials. One last thing you should ask yourself is, if this were a scientific experiment, because we've been talking about that scientific analogy, is it repeatable if you gave the exact same evidence you have to another person? If you think that another person would come to a different conclusion than you should reevaluate what you've taken from the source material and your step-by-step reasoning, because if this is a truly logical inference, then the other person should be able to make the same conclusion as you. If you think another person would make the exact same or very similar conclusion that you've made, then you can feel confident that the inference you've made is valid, it makes sense, it's logical, and you can move on with the rest of your thinking.